Well, this is episode 3.
Episode 3 of the podcast, which we are naming right now.
Right here.
Same
right
time.
now.
1, 2, 3.
Heroes Journal
Journal
Podcast.
Podcast. Nailed it.
The Heroes Journal Podcast.
That's the name.
We named it that because it's the most obvious name. And it's not based off of a shortage of names. We actually had a surplus of options. But it was hard to pick one that felt like really just like obvious. Like this is what they're doing.
You know, this might play into my theory about the unfortunate waste of creative energy when it comes to naming things.
Yeah.
Like, I just noticed that, and I do this too, so I'm not calling anyone out, but like, there's this kind of like weird amount of energy that is given to a creative project about naming it versus doing the actual work of like bringing it to life. Like, people have so much anxiety over, and a name of something is important. I understand that, but like, I feel like a lot of people just sabotage it. So before it even gets a chance to do anything. So I guess my thought is, if we don't like the name, we can always change it.
You know, Nick and I had to have a pretty serious conversation that, because he pitches me ideas and I pitch him ideas just because that's kind of a part of our friendship. And creating like a marketing slogan for a business isn't actually creating a business. Yeah, and I had to learn that the hard way because I come up with slogans and names for businesses all the time, but the actual businesses don't have any validity, but they have a tagline.
Yeah.
It's a fun little game where
It's a fun exercise. Like, I don't know. I like the creative game of like I mean, that's something Colin and I do all the time.
It's true.
We'll just like run entire business scenarios. We'll like pick a product, figure out the margins, do some rough math, figure out a slogan, figure out the market. And it's just like a weird mental exercise that you end up going through. I don't know. Starting a business really changes your perspective about products.
That's true.
And,
Really does.
especially when you're in a store. Like, ever been like a Target or Walmart? Every time I look at a product, I think that someone like worked their tail off to get this into the store,
Yeah.
and they had to like contact Walmart and like, I don't know. I think that's pretty. You never think about that. You're just like, oh, I'm in a store. These are the products available. But people fight really hard to get their products on those shelves and sacrifice a lot.
Yeah, it's like people had to move mountains just to accomplish even a little bit of what they've done. So it's like we see these products in all these stores and they look extremely successful and all that stuff, but they are extremely successful. And it's like you don't really think about the years of work that led up to the moment where you look at the thing you're not going to buy at a Target.
That's a good point. You only see the winners.
Yeah, you only see the winners.
That's the problem.
But everyone's a winner. If you're in Target, you're a winner.
Oh, of course.
That's like I don't know why we're giving Target so much pub right now, but
Yeah. Thanks for listening to the Target podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah. Anyways, yeah. Today we're gonna talk about something a little bit more specific than we've talked about. The first thing, I mean, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, so he's not going to be very surprised. But we're going to talk about Nick's love for Lord of the Rings. Oh. Just as a how it has affected your life. Not like specific. We're not going to talk about the Silmarillion. We're not going to talk about the book series. We're going to talk about what Lord of the Rings means to you and why you think maybe it's impacted your life in the way that it has to a point where you started a company that's loosely based off of it, right? Like that's a pretty big impact.
Yeah. No, that's well said. I don't even know where to start. I mean, I could talk about Lord of the Rings forever. I think and I've thought about this a lot, to your point. Over the last 2 years, starting a company that in a lot of ways is directly inspired by things like Lord of the Rings, makes you think about why you would even do something like that. So, digging deep into like my childhood and my past, I think the quick like 2-minute version of it is I was born in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, which if you guys have ever been to the Midwest or especially Kansas, it's very flat. The landscape, there's a lot of wheat fields, and it's a great place, don't get me wrong, but it looks nothing like New Zealand, or it looks nothing like Lord of the Rings.
Or Washington for that fact.
Or Washington, which is where we live, Washington State. So, I was part of the generation that grew up, watching the like early 2000s movies like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, these like epic, fandom movies that did really well, adapted from books, and, we're part of the big wave of those starting to happen. And Lord of the Rings was extremely profound to me, like, as a kid, as it was to, there's nothing special about that statement. I remember seeing like the Two Towers like 5 or 6 times. I remember forcing my grandmother to take me to go see the Two Towers for like a 4th or 5th time in when we were visiting them in Texas.
A quick interjection here.
Yeah.
Did you read or have someone read The Lord of the Rings to you before you saw the movies, or was it after? And then if it was like intermittent, how did the images in your head change from, because when you're reading something, right, you have to do the legwork of imagining where these people are. Yeah. Did that change after watching the movies? What was that experience like for you? Reading, watching, reading again, potentially. What was that like?
Yeah, my wonderful mother read me The Two Towers for a long while before I would go to bed. Just little sections every night. And I remember thinking it was just like so ridiculous how far they would walk. I remember thinking that specifically. I remember thinking like, this is insane how many miles they're walking every day. That's one of the very weirdly specific things I remember. And in the movie, The Two Towers, there are so many cuts of just Gimli, Aragorn, Legolas running through the New Zealand like countryside. And it really paid off my childhood in a lot of ways, because I was like, they actually do. They go a long way. It's like, that's not a very inspiring statement, but for some reason that really struck a chord with me as a kid. So,
but what was that like? So she read them to you before you saw the movies?
Yeah. It was before and after. She actually had a copy of she had her copy from when she was in high school of The Two Towers. So it's like, I think I still have it, but it's like, it's all beaten up and something that she really loved in high school. And so I'm not really sure why she picked that book. I'm not sure if she was like trying to indoctrinate me or something like that. I always thought my parents were more like Star Trek, Star Wars people, but for whatever reason, yeah, those were the books that I just couldn't get enough of. So I don't really remember the timeline specifically, but definitely seeing it on screen. I mean, when you're a kid, watching a movie is obviously probably a little, especially something like The Helm's Deep, like the best, war fight scene of all time. That's going to get your attention a little more than a book is. So that really, I think those two things, like kind of having a foundation with the book and then kind of the payoff with like the big movie and like all the fight scenes, orcs being killed and stuff. It's like, it was like a perfect storm for me to become a lifelong fan.
Yeah. And then, this is actually something we both had this experience. Mine's not specifically tied to Lord of the Rings, but I moved here from Dallas, Texas, which is not nearly as I don't know, they're not as lush in landscape. Very similar to kind of how you describe Kansas. And so for me, I was like, we're driving on the freeway, and I thought I was in like a national park, right? But you had a little bit different like interpretation of it.
Yeah. So like I was saying, I think I moved here when I was about 10. And one thing that my parents made us do for whatever reason, my dad, kind of grew up in Dallas and then lived in Kansas for a while. So I think always had dreams of being more of like an outdoorsman. So when we moved here, he made like my sister and I go hiking like every weekend, for a long time. Like to the point where we weren't even able to make friends because we just had to go hiking every Saturday, Sunday morning.
Which probably played into the walking motif.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember, I don't know. I digging deep into my childhood and trying to answer the question of like, what's up with me and Lord of the Rings and why is it like the older I get, the more I like it? And I realized that there's a foundation there. Like I associated hiking in the mountains, in the Cascades. It's where we live by the Cascades, right?
There's the Cascades in the Olympics.
Yeah. Well, it's probably close to the closest thing that looks like New Zealand in the States. I'm guessing. I'm not sure. The Pacific Northwest is really beautiful.
Probably more like Montana. I would assume Montana has more, but
whatever it is, compared to Kansas, it was like a different world, and that's what it felt like. Seeing those landscapes in the Lord of the Rings, and then hiking through them as if I was like Legolas or Gimli or something. I just felt this weird, like visceral connection to that world and to those characters. And moving to a new place where I didn't know anybody, that story was really important to me. for whatever reason. So I just kind of held on to it. And the landscape and the environment that I moved into, I think really reinforced the importance of the story of Lord of the Rings for me.
I'm going to make a huge stretch here. This is going to be like, I'm completely taking your experience in your life and making a stretch to apply it to the business. Right?
Let's hear it.
So in one way, right, thinking about Lord of the Rings and all this walking they did got you through these hikes. One thing that you did when you were in like the corporate world and your corporate job is you would kind of resonate on these stories, right? The reason the Heroes Journal exists is because you finished watching the Lord of the Rings series and then you went to work and you were like, my life's not as mystical as I want it to be. You wanted there to be this, like, you almost wanted there to be a way that you could think about yourself as Legolas or these people walking at work in the same way that you used to use that for hikes. So, I mean, it's kind of like there's kind of a correlation there that you like this like blending of your fandoms and the real world that you live in.
Yeah, using the power of fiction, if you will, to inspire you to get through the day to day. Maybe as like a sedative or distraction from.
Was that too much of a stretch?
I think every millennial maybe on that level. I mean, along with like growing up in the generation that was kind of, we'll say, enamored with these other worlds, these like Harry Potters or like Narnia's, Lord of the Rings. Like pick a book or pick a movie. There's tons of them. I don't know, for whatever reason, I feel like especially millennials, our generation, just got hit with this escapism from the real world, and so I don't know if I'd call it like I can't get through the workday without imagining myself with like a bow and arrow, but yeah, I remember that contrast. I think that there's themes in Lord of the Rings that don't really touch on like going to an office job. But I think I realized that even though it's never as cool as like, accompanying a ring-bearing hobbit to a mountain of like a volcano. Even though life isn't that exciting, like there's something that's more true about that story than there is about walking into that office and like the smell of, office carpet and cubicles and stuff. It's like there's something deeply profound about that story and the inspiration to live a life that I think is worth, living like correctly and living in a noble way, living in like in a focused, quest-driven way. So, as you can, it was just kind of a matter of time for me, I think, before the Heroes Journal really made sense to me as an idea.
Yeah,
kind of fully formulated. Yeah.
So I'm gonna put an optimistic spin on what you said.
Okay.
So you said it's not that I need a bow and arrow to get through the workday, but the optimistic spin is that you don't need a bow and arrow to get through the workday, but the workday would be so much better if you had one, right? That's like I think that's what the Heroes Journal offers.
I think so.
Right. And I think that's the spin that like watching the Lord of the Rings the night before you go back to your job that has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. That's what that offers. And I think that's what people, at least the people who we interact with, I think that we're all constantly trying to find a way to integrate the things that we genuinely love. We would go out of the way and do really kind of like painful things just to experience it. Like it's like people stay up all night to go watch a movie at midnight because they want to be the first ones to see it. Yeah. And they've been waiting for it for so long. Or people get dressed up like Legolas and they cosplay and they stand outside in the cold because they want so badly to feel this. And I think that it's right. It's like, it's very justified. And it's actually a really great thing to have in life where it's like, I want to do this thing, even if it's like up to the point, like very, very painful. I wasn't using the word excruciating, but I don't think that's pretty dramatic, but we're so willing to put ourselves in scenarios we probably wouldn't put ourselves in to like get one step closer to feeling this connection with these things that we love.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just more accepted now too. Like,
yeah.
I can't speak for generations before me, but from what I can tell, there wasn't as accepting of like a merging of those two worlds. It was kind of like you have your professional life and you have your personal life. And if you like doing nerdy stuff or you like reimagining yourself in a different world, keep that to yourself. When you walk in the workplace, it's like all business. I think that as we've progressed, and especially in modern workplaces, there's been a big move towards, finding your superpower
Mm-hmm.
or like finding what inspires you or like figuring out your why. It's been a lot of kind of like merging of that personal and that professional to get the best work and the best
Yeah.
work-life balance out of like those two aspects of someone's life, you know?
Yeah. I don't have a direct quote for this, and I'm probably going to butcher it. But I have a general idea. So there's a poet named Wallace Stevens, and I took Professor Webster, Dr. Webster's class in college.
Yep.
And he said this. I didn't write down the quote, but this sentence always resonated with me. And it was Wallace Stevens was like a vice president at an insurance company, but he was also like a great American poet. So these two things that feel very,
It's really different.
yeah, they're very, they feel like they would be in contrast with one another.
Absolutely.
And either Wallace Stevens said it or someone said it about Wallace Stevens or it was something adjacent to him. Said that mundanity was actually the canvas in which he painted his art. So it's like you have these things like a typical 9 to 5 that seem very mundane. You go to it every day. But if you find a way to inject creativity into that, you're actually able to make a really exciting, enjoyable life because you're able to look at things through the lens of the things you truly care about.
Yeah.
And you're also able to like provide for yourself, and you're able to create this foundation and the stability for yourself that actually allows you to be more creative on your off time.
Yeah, that's really well said. Gosh, I don't know why, but when you said that, it made me think of there's like a really early scene in Harry Potter where he's in his room under the stairs at the Dudleys. It's before he ever goes to Hogwarts, and he's like playing. I think he's playing with these action figures, or they're not really action figures. They're like more like chess pieces. It's like a foreshadowing to Wizard's chess. He's not actually playing chess, but it's just like this idea of like, you know, humans like inherently like our imaginations are just so driven by story and like to you know portray meaning to some kind of circumstance. Like building a story around it, even if it isn't true, is way more comforting to us and way more easier for us to stomach than just like the facts, for instance. So fiction, right? Like even if you're Harry Potter, like, and you go to a crazy world, fiction in using your imagination to to play or to, you know, indulge yourself in these imaginary worlds, I think it does provide you a sense of internal connection with yourself. Like, and it really shows you what you care about. Like it can take you to this mystical world where there's like wizards and dragons and stuff, but the emotions and the human side of those characters are the relatable part. And it's kind of like it distracts maybe your surface level senses to kind of get to a deeper, you know, a deeper part of you, which I think is sort of the other side of that, like using mundanity as the canvas, right? It's like this idea of we're going to take this, you know, hobbit, but we're going to give them the same emotions that you have. We're going to throw them in this crazy scenario, but like what they feel is going to be what you feel, you know, and over time you'll see that like you actually have a lot in common with this like imaginary, you know, thing. And it'll tell you more about yourself. I think that that's the real trick of like why something like Lord of the Rings is so impactful to people. It's not like because I believe hobbits are real or something like that. It's because like I believe that the feelings portrayed in these stories and in these scenarios are reflective of how I believe the world to work. So anyway, it was a long-winded way of just saying I think fiction is like can be more true than what we see in a mundane reality, if that makes sense.
If you could stop plugging our YouTube channel, that'd be great.
Yeah. Anyway, so subscribe to the YouTube channel. We make Talking Head videos every week.
Yeah. So I think it's actually funny because it's fiction, but it's not like as fiction as Lord of the Rings. I think that the movie that does this the best is Walter Mitty, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. I saw that movie and I don't think it did that well. I don't think people like necessarily gave it like amazing reviews, but I loved it. I watched it. It was great, right? Ben Stiller was the perfect person for that role, all that stuff. But it was like you have a guy who works in like the basement floor, does all like he develops all the photos for the people who live these incredible lives, right? And then one day he decides, you know what? I'm gonna start acting out these dreams that I have for myself, right? and he has a reason for it, right? He meets a girl or whatever not. So he gives himself a reason to go after all these crazy dreams he's never really lived out. And I actually think that's kind of, I mean, I'm only 25, so I didn't have a lot of years of not living out things and like dreaming about things. But I think that was one of the reasons why the Hero's Journal was so exciting to me. It's like, what does it look like to start a company? What does it look like to put yourself out there and run a Kickstarter? What does it look like to have to go on Facebook and say, hey guys, I'm running a Kickstarter for this thing, and then telling all your friends and family to share it on their platforms and like being really vulnerable about this thing that you've been working on and having to do like front facing iPhone videos about like it's coming up in one day and then it like I send it to you and it flips upside down and all this stuff, right? Like what does that feel like? What does that look like? And it's honestly scary. It's extremely scary. I think that's one of the more vulnerable moments like I've ever experienced of having to like show people this project that I've been working on. Yeah. And I think all of that plays into like that Secret Life of Walter Mitty vibe of like, instead of thinking about what it would be like to start a company, see like what it would look like to work for yourself, what it feels like to quit your job, what it feels like to hire someone, and like what it feels like to have the whole thing on your back, and if it fails, it's your fault, kind of thing. Like what that feels like. Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why, like, when we had this, when you had the idea, and then you're like, should we do it? And I'm like, yeah. It's like I think that's one of the reasons why I did it was I wanted to see what that was like, and I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to wait until another time, for maybe another opportunity or something else.
Yeah, that was really well said. I mean, and Walter Mitty's a great movie. It's a great example of, I think, that like similar call to adventure, similar idea. Like the whole time I was thinking of like Bilbo, right? It's like he's in the Shire, doesn't want to leave, very comfortable in this crazy world filled with adventure, but like tucked away in his basement, his hobbit hole. In the moment he's kind of forced out to go on an adventure, takes it, and he understands the world in a whole new way, and it totally changes everything for him. Yeah, same idea. I really like what you said about actually doing the thing. That's the real difference, I think, about, you know, like fiction and real life. Is in a good fiction is like, we know the hero is going to go. We know that the story has to move forward. And we don't really get a lot of insight on like, what did the other hobbits say? What are the other people in the basement that work next to Walter Mitty? Like, what were they thinking? Like, and if it's anything like our Kickstarter, they're probably thinking like, oh, that's not going to work. Like, oh, I've seen this before. I know how this goes. You know what I mean? It's like this weird kind of like, oh, I understand what you're doing. I can tell you everything that's going to happen, but they've never gone before. Like the people in the basement are still in the basement. The other hobbits in the Shire, still in the Shire. You know, it's like, and I'm sure people like seeing us launch a Kickstarter are probably thinking like, I don't understand this idea, or like, I don't get how this is going to work, or like, there's never going to be any like growth to this business, like past Kickstarter. And I think we even kind of believe that a little bit ourselves, but in life, there's so many, I think there's a lot more voices, right, than there is in like a typical fiction. Like there's so many reasons, I should say, to never go, to never step out, to never leave the basement or the Shire. And on top of that, there's so many other like naysayers. But it's just on the other side of that. That's the funny part, is like, I think even before we ever succeeded at anything, just like the thrill of creating something was like pretty exhilarating on its own, even if it failed. I think that's what we started out with in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, selfishly, I wanted it to fail.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I was good enough to do this. I didn't know if I was good enough to fulfill someone's journal. I didn't know what that looked like. It was just like, it was scary. It was like a lot of work. And I was like, I'm going to be really tired if this works out. Like I'm signing myself up to be exhausted. And I think we ran the numbers after the Kickstarter, and I think we lost $70.
Yep. Lost $70.
Yeah. We were like, so it's like, you're telling me I can work for 10 months straight on this project.
On the side. After my full-time job.
To lose $70. Yeah. Obviously it was $70. Then we had some extra inventory, and it obviously kicked us,
of course,
onto this path. I think this is really interesting, right? So this is where real life is better than fiction. And I think that this is the true point that I want to make about all the creativity and stuff, is that if you're able to use the inspiration that you get from fiction, but these characters, they go through like one story, right? They have one rallying cry.
Yeah.
For the most part. I mean, there are definitely more complex characters out there, and I'm probably gonna get a lot of comments about all these really in-depth stories. But the reason I love real life more than fiction is because call to adventures, ordeals, and all of these like flows of life, though they happen in order, you get a new call to adventure, you start a new journey without even knowing it. If you think about our experience with all of these things, we've gone through like 10, 15 cycles of this call to adventure, getting home, outgrowing your new world, having to start out on a new thing. And no one tells you. No one's like, hey, like you reach a checkpoint. There's no saving and going back. It's like you are growing and you don't even realize it. Yeah. In the way that, like, if we had to go back and do the Kickstarter thing again, I think that we would be like, we not that we wouldn't appreciate it, but we would be bored with the amount of work, because we've already gotten past, like, we know how to fulfill things. We know how to do this. We know how to do that. It would have to be more difficult to engage us in the same way that it engaged us in the past. And you don't realize that until you think about it. And like, you have these little ordeals pop up, right? Our journals went missing for 2 weeks. We're trying to get a space, and the landlord's like, no. And then we have to like overcome that. We have like an issue with our shipping where the wrong journals are getting sent to people, and we have to figure that out. And it's like, all of these things are happening constantly, and you're kind of getting sent out on these little mini call to adventures and these mini quests. And then you also have these big overarching quests, right? Like, what does it look like to live and work and ship out of the same place for 18 months with your friends and your family, in my case? And what does it look like to grow a business and hopefully make this thing much bigger than it is? So you have these big things, you have these little things going on. It's very nuanced. It's very intricate, and it has to happen over a long period of time. It can't happen in 300 pages. It can't happen in a 2-hour movie. Yeah. And you have to just figure it out live.
Well, it's funny because you live it live, which is a pretty obvious statement, but you conceptualize it backwards. Like, Hero's journey makes sense in a 2-hour movie because you know what you're dealing with. Mm-hmm. You have 2 hours, and if you pause the movie at like an hour and a half in, you know that you're probably somewhere around the ordeal, somewhere around the big climax of the movie, resurrection, whatever you want to call it, and then road home. You know, you can pick where the timeline's at. Life doesn't really work like that. It's like a constant live stream. So you have to make sense of those events. And if you don't make sense of those events, it's not going to feel like there's a sense of completion or a sense of accomplishment or a sense of like leveling up. You don't ever really feel like you're going anywhere if you're not able to like document those things. I guess I'd agree with you. I think that's why maybe real life is a little better than fiction, because especially running a business, you just get these really cool milestones as time goes on, and it's so easy to forget those. But like, as you write them down, and obviously as like, you know, business today is very data driven, which data has a lot to do with history. So it's like, you kind of get to these little stories, right? These little like, oh man, like I remember in that month we did this much in sales and we had this big problem and we had to like do this with journals. That was a lot to overcome, but it ended up working out. Or it's like, I don't know. I just really like this idea of creating narratives about whatever you're doing in life, whether it's business or it's a relationship or whatever. And no matter how long it is, it could be like a 24-hour time period, but it's like, I started the day, I followed my call to adventure, something bad happened, I overcame it, you know, and now I'm back where I started, and I look at everything a little different. That's a hero's journey in one day. But that can happen over the course of 10 years, 15 years, and it should. I think it's just important to make sense of those stories because they get lost otherwise. I'm just kind of rambling now. But
yeah. No, it's funny. This is a complete non sequitur. Well, it's not non sequitur, but it's not directly affiliated. Yeah. Yesterday was a bottle episode. I don't know if you realized that.
Was it?
You and I spent the entire day in the warehouse,
Yeah.
dealing with like little problems here and there, having to figure stuff out. And we spent like the entire day in the warehouse. It was a bottle episode.
I love that joke. It's a bottle episode.
It
was kind of a bottle episode.
And you have those, like you have
Yeah.
these days where you like, or weeks, right? I think last week I spent the entire week in the warehouse, trying to get the purples out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that week was a bottle episode. Every event, major event happened in the warehouse.
Mm.
And in a way, like the 18 months of us living here, right? For, I guess it could be longer, but the 18 months we signed up for, it's kind of like a sitcom, right?
Yeah.
It's like
season
it's
one.
like the friend's apartment, you know. It's all like they all have these key places that they kind of just cycle through. It's Jerry Seinfeld's apartment, and a lot of crazy little things happen here and there. You have these episodes that are very thematic, but you also have this long narrative going on. Maybe not Jerry Seinfeld because that's a show about nothing, but you have you have this character growth in the background, but you also have these events that happen on an individual basis, whether it's weekly based, monthly based, or daily based. And it's really interesting, right? Because you think back on these times and you're like, wow, that was really something that happened to me. Not happened to me. I guess happened to me makes it sound like you're passive, but like that's something I really experienced.
Yeah. Like I'm living a story. I think that's maybe that's the real feeling of like, you know, to tie it back. Maybe that's the real reason I felt like I had to take Lord of the Rings into my office job, because I wanted to feel like I was living a story. And even if that part of the story was like not the best part of the story yet, I wanted to feel like I was like in training camp, or I was like in the ordeal, and it was going to get better. It was going to be more polished and focused and more in line with what I really wanted to do with my life. So I don't really know. I do have a question for you though, because you mentioned like in the past, like early on, you were saying that, kind of without saying it, essentially feeling this massive imposter syndrome from like doing the Kickstarter, fulfilling orders, thinking like I have no idea what I'm doing. I can't believe people are even trusting me to do this. Like,
Yeah.
Is that like, how is that kind of like taken place as time has gone on, right? Because, you know, to your point and kind of what we've been talking about, you wake up in this story, like you wake up in the hero's headquarters, you obviously have been doing something right.
Yeah.
So like, how does that clash, or how does that mold with this like evolving imposter syndrome if you still have it?
Oh, 100% still have it. I mean, I think imposter syndrome will follow you wherever you go. I don't think that, I think that most people feel it to a certain extent, no matter what happens, right? Because it's the Peter principle, right? You continue to grow until it's like you reach your capacity. I don't know if there's like a scientific level of that, but I feel that, right? And it's funny because I don't have imposter syndrome for things that we've already done. Like I know that I could have done all the things that I've already done because I've already done them, right? Like, I don't have imposter syndrome about our first Kickstarter,
Right.
because we accomplished it and we got things to people in a relatively timely manner. It wasn't
Like you said, it's kind of the opposite. You'd be bored if you had to do our Kickstarter.
exactly.
Yeah.
And and in no way do I want that to reflect about how like thankful I am for that Kickstarter.
Right.
But the thing is that every day new problems appear, which means there's a new reason to be an imposter, right? It's like, yeah, I can do the things that I've already done, but can I do new things?
Yeah.
And every day you're looking at these new quests, these new problems, these new ordeals in the face, and you're like, I don't know if I got this one.
Yeah. Interesting.
And it's good, right? I think that it's good. I the more that I struggle with the imposter syndrome, because now, I mean, like we had this conversation with Zach yesterday, like you and I have to be managers now. Like we're not necessarily doers in the same way that we were in the past. And we have to be better about delegating and learning from the people that we work with, because the people we work with are so much better at the things that they do than we are. And that's why they're here, right? That's why we brought them on to help us, is because they're better at what they do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the imposter syndrome is actually, for me at least, it's a really good Richter of learning from all the things that we're doing and all the ordeals that we're having, and being aware of like, I'm not infallible. I have issues. Like I have things that really are painful to work through from like a like I don't know this. Like there are problems that are like painful, right? It's like the shipping isn't working in the way that it should. Like Shopify is not sending ShipStation all the information that they need to, and I have to go and fix it. I don't know how I'm gonna fix it. Like that's like it's like internally painful, and I'm like, am I even good enough to do this? Am I gonna mess this up for all of our customers, all of our heroes rather? Yeah, so I think that, but I also think that it keeps me really grounded. I think that that's the part of the hero, right? Because if Bilbo or Frodo was like, yeah, I got this, it's like, oh, ring to a mountain.
I can't relate to that. As an audience member, right?
Yeah.
Bilbo's like, I'm the best.
Of course, yeah.
It's kind of like, I don't want to throw too much shade. They remade Mulan, the live action version. I couldn't even make it through the movie, to be honest, because I love the original Mulan so much. I think it's literally a masterpiece. It might be one of the best animated Disney movies of all time. But they kind of created Mulan as this character who was overwhelmingly powerful, but her conflict, like her struggle, was not using her full power, and it just didn't work because it wasn't relatable enough, right? Like the original Mulan was like, thrown into this world where she was like the only woman surrounded by all these men, so she had to solve problems in different ways than they would.
Yeah,
they're using like muscle, and she's like using creativeness, and that character worked so well and was so much more relatable, right? To someone who's like, who has that feeling, right? Like everyone else is doing this and they deserve to be doing it, but I'm the imposter here. I don't belong here. So I have to like, fit in, or I have to get my stuff together to figure this out. So anyway, I don't know why that reminded me of Mulan so much, but I think it's well said.
I have one more point.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of my goals, I try to make sure that I have perspective in everything I do. I try to make sure that I'm living like in a way that I value. And one of my things, and then this is like, it's kind of hard on myself, but like I want to live a life worth talking about. And every life is worth talking about because every life is important. But I wanted to use that as like a driving force in my life to remind myself that I want to attempt to do more, and I want to put myself out there, out of my comfort zone. And I want to talk about those stories. I want to talk about the failures. I want to talk about the successes. And I think that a part of living a life worth talking about, for me at least, is putting myself in scenarios where I'm underprepared from like a skill set standpoint. I have all the tools I need, but it's not like I just don't know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to figure it out, because that to me is really great storytelling. Is you put someone in a place with like almost an insolvable problem, and you see how they handle it. Yeah. No one's ever prepared for these great stories that go on. And I think that's really important in life, right? It's like making a bet on yourself, saying I can recruit the right allies to come help me work on this thing, but also I'm willing to take credit for either the success of this thing or the failure of this thing. It's true. And being humble enough to be like, I messed up, I need your help, but also being like, Well,
it's funny. I think that you that's like essentially at least part of the hero's journey, right? Mm-hmm. Taking a character, dropping them into a problem that they don't necessarily have the capability to nonchalantly, solve. So it's like they have to be pressed in some way. But it's interesting because, like, we're talking about imposter syndrome, which I guess within this conversation, I would kind of like pose that as sort of your like shadow, like the inner problem, like, the other Kyle, that shadow Kyle that is the villain, right? So yeah, you get dropped into the problem of like, hey, run this business and start from nothing. So you have these like obstacles, external obstacles, the internal obstacle, which is like the thing that we really like to see the hero, interact with, is like that imposter syndrome, right? Because I think that's the relatable aspect. It's like, yeah, I don't know why, but yeah, when you were saying like solve a problem, I thought of the movie Enigma. Is that what it's called? With
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Benedict Cumberbatch, yeah.
Glad I got that one right.
Yeah, you nailed it. We both love that movie.
Oh,
and the soundtrack to that movie.
It's so good.
We both written a lot of college papers to the soundtrack movie.
Yeah.
There is a part in the soundtrack where someone knocks on a door, and it's terrifying.
It's terrifying
It's
because
very
you get
loud.
really in the zone, right? You like
Yeah.
you're like "Da-da-da-da-da," and then it's like pop pop pop. You're looking around. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Really good movie, but it's all about solving a problem. You have a main character who's like a genius, and the problem becomes bigger than just, decoding the German war messages. It becomes about this person coming to terms with who they are and working with other people and letting other people into their genius, into their life. And I think that's why that's such a masterful movie, because they have this literally like real world problem that it was actually a real problem in the world and, threatened the lives of millions. But it also really dealt with the interpersonal, internal struggle. So I know I'm really harping on this idea, but that's what I really love about good storytelling. And in light of like trying to live a life we're talking about, I think a life we're talking about is like a life that stares in the face of these external conflicts. How do you run a business? And answers those questions by looking internally, fighting that villain, and winning all of it. Because that's what people are able to relate to. Like, oh man, this guy like runs a business and his life's so cool and stuff. But on an emotional level, like he like feels the same things that I do, and maybe he always has. In the same way that like I felt the same way Bilbo has, or Walter Mitty, or Mulan, or whatever it is. I think that's like the real beauty of like living a life we're talking about and being a relatable person in that way.
Yeah. I mean, so throw back to last podcast. Yeah. Little reincorporation here. We talked about journaling and what that's like to find an old piece of treasure. And it's that, right? It's like I look back at sophomore in college Kyle, and he didn't think he was good enough to be like a track captain. He didn't think he was good enough to even run in college, like all of these things. Yeah. Didn't think he was smart enough to be getting the GPA he's getting. Like all of the stuff feels like it's happening to him. He's not actually forcing it to happen. Right. And those are things now that I'm very confident that I could do again. Maybe not with my body now, because I'm a little bit old and decrepit at this point from a college athlete standpoint. But like I know that I could handle those issues because I lived through them. Mm-hmm. And now I read those things. I read and I feel the feelings that Kyle was saying. And I feel those exact same things now. And I realize it's never about making those things go away.
Right.
It's about realizing that that's a natural part of trying something new and trying to solve the problems in front of you. Yeah. It is actually kind of a superpower. It's kind of like, it's like the ability to feel pain, right? Like if you couldn't feel pain, you put your hand on the stove, you burn your hand. But the fact that you have pain actually keeps you safe from burning your hand on the stove. So it's like the imposter syndrome keeps you safe from being overconfident and promising too much or getting too ahead of yourself and actually creating problems that you cannot solve by yourself. Yeah. And it forces you to like really take inventory of what can I accomplish today? What can I accomplish tomorrow? And I think it's like people always overestimate what they can accomplish in a year and underestimate what they can accomplish in 5 years.
Yes.
And that's probably tied into that, right? If you can get a really honest inventory of allies that you have, skill sets you have, tools that you have, it helps you give a better idea of like, okay, this is what I can accomplish this year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And recognizing that when it gets really hard, all the feelings that I'm feeling now are going to come right back in. I think that's really important.
It's really well said. Yeah, just the idea that there's two sides to something like imposter syndrome, right? Like we so often think of it as a solely negative attribute about a person, or like I guess in our context, a hero, right? So, but the truth is like there's actually a really positive side to that, like keeping you from hurting yourself more, or from keeping you from being overconfident. It was interesting because you're talking about journaling, and it made me realize something. I've never thought about this before. I've heard you say like I want to live life we're talking about, that kind of thing before, which is a really great thing to live by. I guess I heard it in a different way this time around. Even in the sense of like having old journals, like this concept of having a life worth talking about, even if you are talking to your future self. I think that's like a really interesting idea. Because, you know, my first thought is like cocktail parties and strangers, and you like, you're an impressionist and you have this great resume and everyone's like, oh, it's, you know, but the real gold of that, right, is like, I want to tell my future self about myself now, because that's worth talking about. It's a really like, I don't know if that's what you mean when you say that. It's the first time I thought about it in that regard.
It's certainly a factor. This is something that I have to work on, but it's like when people ask me about the Heroes Journal, when I have like a friend who's like, hey, how's it going? Or I meet someone at like a grocery store and for some reason it comes up or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I have a really hard time talking about it because I continually think of it as like I'm starting. Mm-hmm. And why would I talk about something I'm starting? Right.
Yeah.
I want to talk about something when it's done. But the weird thing is that things don't end. It's like, you know what I mean? You're constantly going through beginnings. You're not necessarily going through finish lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like a part of like we're living a life we're talking about is thinking about things as beginnings and continue to strive for more, because you don't really like being around someone who talks about all the things they've done. Yeah. You like talking about people who are things they're doing. Because that's more interesting, right? You want to talk to someone like meeting Indiana Jones at an archaeological site is 1,000 times more interesting than sitting in his lecture about the archaeological site that he was at.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my issue with the whole telling the story thing is that I want to talk about the things that I'm doing, not things that I've done. But a lot of times the focus is on like how many sales have you done, or how many things, like how many, like what's it like living in the Heroes headquarters? Like those things have already happened. I want to talk about the things that are going to happen. I want to talk about the things that are painfully frightening. Like we're trying to do all these things and we're trying to grow this thing and we're trying to build new products and all this stuff. And that's like both wildly entertaining to me, but also terrifying. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
That's
it's like
the new imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
That's the thing in the spotlight at the moment.
I don't know if that resonates with you.
No, it totally resonates with me. It's so weird. The more we go on with this business and like the bigger it grows, the more successful we get, the less I want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. With like, especially strangers, especially people that like, they're like, oh, you run that business. Like, tell me about it. I do my best to like, I'm like, yep, it's a thing and it's happening and I run it.
Yeah, we are aware of the irony of saying we don't like talking about the business and then starting a podcast to talk about the business for an hour a week. Yeah, but fair.
I guess, well, it's just weird to be caught. I don't want to say off guard, but just it's weird to maybe be seen as that. So anyway, yeah, to your point, I think that there's just a lot of people want to maybe quickly put you in some kind of like box, I guess, and not in like a negative way. I think it's just a way of like people, I don't know, can understand, right? Quickly understand you. It's like, oh, you're the guy, you run a business, you know, and they'll usually say like, are you guys on Amazon? Or like, you should make an app, right? There's always like the weird advice they give you. But I think it's just them trying to like conceptualize what you're really doing. And to me, I think like that's what I really mean when I say other people in the Shire. It's like other people that are like, oh, I understand what that is. Kind of in this way, it's like, oh, I could have done that. It's like this idea of, yeah, like you said, people talking about what other people have done or what they could do themselves, as opposed to people that are doing the actual thing. It's a world of difference. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know when the day will come where I'm like, yeah, I run this business and I'm like really proud of it and you should check it out. But I'm just not there yet.
Yeah, so we're like we're not trying to like get investors. We're not trying to do like the biggest thing someone can do to like, if I pitched it to them, the biggest thing they could do for me is like be excited about the product and buy it and then finish a journal. That's the biggest thing. I would never want someone to buy a journal so they could just put it on their shelf, right? It's like buy the journal, finish it, text me, hey, Kyle, I finished this journal. It was amazing. Or like not even the journal was amazing. Like I finished this and this is my goal. And this is what I accomplished in the last 3-4 months, whatever it is. And I don't think an elevator pitch would truly get someone on that path. And so maybe it's more or less, it's not necessarily finding a right way to pitch your business to someone. It's like, how can I tell someone what I do to help them want to accomplish something they've always wanted to do, right? Like, because it doesn't benefit me or the Hero's Journal if someone is like, wow, that's cool. You know, that doesn't, I don't necessarily look for that validation. Though it's very kind of people to say nice things, and I'm very appreciative of that. But my goals right now are all around people accomplishing the things they've never done, and like becoming the hero of their story, and taking ownership over the events, and realizing that like there are all these different storytelling techniques, whether it's like a sitcom or a bottle episode or a trilogy, or all these all of these different movie storytelling techniques, and we're all probably living one of them.
Yeah.
And being able to recognize that and being able to take ownership over the days that we live. And I don't think you can do that in elevator pitch. I think you do it in a form like this, maybe, or by getting people to helping people finish journals, so they can realize like, oh, I can actually do things in 3-month periods.
Yeah, I mean, I really like what you said. There's a lot of ways to tell a story, but there's nothing better than like a real life story that you know is real, that the details aren't perfect. It's not like a pretty, 2-hour movie, bow tied around it, Hollywood, visual effects, all that stuff. It's like real life. You get a lot of notifications when you run an e-commerce business on your phone and on your computer and stuff. You get a lot of emails and whatnot. And like, despite the years of doing this, to this day, like the best notifications I get on my phone are when we get a review, or when someone posts their story in like our Facebook group, or when someone is just really honest about what their experience was using this thing, and literally being a part of that part, like that story in their life, I think is one of the most honoring and validating things. You were talking about validation. Like, that's one of the most validating feelings to me, is when a story that may be inspired by a fictional land takes hold of someone's real life, and they end up bettering themselves because of it, or at least focusing on bettering themselves, even if they make no real world steps. Just thinking around what it would take to get better or improve their life or make their story better, I think is one of the most validating, significant things that we could ever possibly do. And I don't see that changing. Sales numbers could go up, more employees could join, more products could happen, but like the real like life change, seeing that happen, is like it's just the best. It's the best
true.
thing.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good place to end. Mostly just because that's a great bow, right? Mm-hmm. I think that in anything that you venture to do, finding out what's successful to you, and there are probably businesses and things that we could have done that getting a sale would be the greatest thing that could happen for that thing.
Yeah, of course.
Just that this particular product in this particular world that we live in is very based off people becoming the hero of their story.
Right. That's true.
So yeah, that's if anyone watching has a great review, either negative or positive, about your experience with the journal, like, just know that whenever we receive those are the highlight of our days and weeks.
Yeah.
And when we go over like all the business stuff of like profit margin and numbers, those are always sandwiched between good reviews and bad reviews and experiences with people and how we can make this a better thing. So
yeah. So please leave us reviews. Like,
yeah.
And they don't have to be like 5-star review. It could be an email, or it can be a Facebook review or a post.
Yeah.
It could be public or private. We just love hearing how people are interacting with this thing, because it helps us make it better. So
yeah.
Anyway. Yeah.
And if you want to learn more about us and our company, you can subscribe for more of these podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe there. Or if you want to learn more about fandoms, storytelling techniques, and journaling techniques, you can you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we post weekly about those particular things. And if you really feel so inclined, you can even like this video and go and like all of our other videos on our YouTube channel. Yeah. It really helps us out. But that is the Hero's Journal podcast number 3, talking about imposter syndrome, goal setting, and Nick's love for Lord of the Rings. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening, guys.